Welcome to episode 8 of Reading to Mom. My name is Joe, the publisher at Historia Research in Chicago, Illinois. If you enjoyed the last few chapters centering around Sidra and her first forays to the Lyman, you'll be disappointed to learn that the following chapter, the chapter you're about to listen to, gets back to more mundane subjects like the nature of democracy and why civilizations fail. Why he finds it necessary to return to his historical analysis is beyond me, but one of the benefits is that he no longer has to pretend to be a voice actor. So I am truly pleased to introduce the author reading to his mom. Hi, Mom. I'm excited to introduce you to the Acropolis in Chapter 7. It's the main setting for Sidra's narrative about this period of time near the end of the Arcane Age. Now, some perhaps have not picked up on the idea that we have jumped forward 1,500 years since the introduction of the Provenance. Chapter 7 then is a sort of summary of some significant changes that are occurring near the end of the Arcane Age, and particularly at this outpost, this Acropolis, on the border of the Provenance and the Lyman. A key marker in the failure of democracies typically is the destruction of the commons, or the public good, or commonwealth, a sense of commonwealth and social well-being. Here it is signified by the sale or acquisition of the civic administration building at the center of the Acropolis. We learn about events transpiring at the Acropolis through a conversation that Kievan and Sidra have as he escorts her through the Acropolis for the first time on the way to an inn that he recommends to her. The discussion centers around what has made the Provenance the most powerful civilization of its time, and why or how its democracy has contributed to the grandeur of its people. An important point, lost on some, is that this is not a despotic world filled with would-be kings and would-be queens who wish to rule a destitute population. This is a civilization populated by thoughtful individuals seeking self-fulfillment and good governance. Chapter 7. Coin apoitea, coin apoitea, coin apoitea. On her return from the kobold's lair, Oron greeted Sidra with an exclamation. "You have returned, Green Shanks!" Partially in surprise, partially in disappointment, she suspected. The two verbally sparred over the intent of his words for a short time, until Eosh angrily interrupted and demanded that the gatekeeper allow her to proceed into the fortress.
Oron grew pale in the face, if such is possible for the Mixling, then motioned to his men to allow me and my companions to enter the Acropolis.
As Sidra passed the defeated gatekeeper, Oron informed her that the dynasty's obligations forced him to postpone his first meeting with the High Council's attaché until the following day. She later learned that the local bureaucracy of the mountain outpost had summoned the territorial governor to their assembly hall to explain the lack of progress for recent efforts to pacify or suppress the aggressive Lyman cultures. With the dynasties preoccupied, the gatekeeper advised Sidra to tour the Acropolis and find lodging at the boarding house in the Commoners' District. The delay suited Sidra, who privately wrote in her journal,
"I prefer to see the dynasties alone, apart from my contentious associates."
Sidra thanked all of her companions and dismissed Matna, Eosh, and Brajana immediately upon entering the Acropolis. Kievan, on the other hand, she asked to remain as a guide through the districts of the immense fortress.
More so, to accompany me until I felt at ease with the foreignness of the place.
She admitted. The dark lashes of your enemy's trembling shadows unsettled her most. They had reached the Acropolis in the mid-afternoon, well after the sun began its descent from its apex in the southern sky. The sunshine weaved through your enemy's crown, creating a striation of light and shadows that offered ample cover to the dastardly thieves who hid within the Acropolis. Every other step through the outpost streets seemed to force the cleric to alternate between the blinding glare of the sun and the gloomy umbra of the spires.
I startled at the slightest provocation of the passers-by as my eyes adjusted to real and imagined blind spots around me.
She noted, if her return to the Acropolis had been timelier, Sidra undoubtedly could have navigated the Acropolis on her own. The outpost, like most settlements and cities in the Provenance, mirrored the spatial order and architectural design of the innermost fortresses of the original cities. Libua, Alcyonius, and Agrenio, after their recovery by the peoples of the Provenance, took shape following the model of Panoptes and Naxos. The one exception, the dwarves, had built Pallene into the igneous rock of a volcanic peak in the Ferris Mountains. Nonetheless, the interior layout of Pallene incorporated the same basic divisions of social space as the skyward-facing cities. Footnote 1. Melanglin, the Arcane System of Cubits, pages 97 to 109. From his examination of the Arcane's personal sense of spatial harmony, Melanglin speculated that the dwarves similarly devised the public spaces of the Provenance to elicit social harmony among the five interests of the people as a whole. End footnote. To the modern mind, the epic scale and ornate masonry of the fortresses present a fantastic spectacle. Alien structures constructed by ancestors seemingly from another plane of existence. The arcane dwarves who built the Acropolis designed the stronghold of the Provenance with the idea that the social organization of the fortress architecture shaped events as much as, if not more than, the heroics of its occupants. To posterity's great fortune, Sidra's reports and journal provide one of the most rich and exhaustive descriptions of the Acropolis, offering a unique glimpse into the social order and cultural life of the Provenance in general near the end of the Arcane Age. The most striking feature to the modern eye is the pentagonal shape of the Acropolis, a replication of the five forest and plain cities to the east. In the Provenance, dwarven engineers typically erected 5 walls around communities to protect citizens from the depredation of outlaws and beasts. Whereas the origins of the 5-sided design remain unknown, scholars nonetheless regard the pentagon as a figural embodiment of the Provenancial people's ideals for cosmic order. Footnote 2. One ancient alternative argument to Melanglin attributes the division of social spaces into 5 equal parts to the prime number of ether. While geos and the prime number 3 represent matter and substance, ether and the prime number 5 represent space and position. When the arcane peoples divided a space, then, they sought to harmonize divisions in a way that conformed to the numerology for the prime number of ether. Hence, the pentagon was more than a geometric shape or architectural predilection. It was a cosmopolis, embodying cosmogony and the rational order of the arcane mind. The oldest expression of this argument is found in the ancient Sumerian text, Ptolemy of Nunth's Cosmopolis, written in Nippur around 991 of the Metal Age. End footnote. Sidra, passing beneath the massive gates leading to the promenade, captured this sentiment when Kivon advised her, "You will find a familiar comfort in the sight of arcanists, mercenaries, and commoners gathered in the mechanics district to haggle over services, or in the merchants district to exchange wares." Yet, when Sidra passed through the Acropolis, she stepped through a microcosm of the social life in the Provenance as it existed in the latter years of the Arcane Age. And with those same steps, she left the familiar confines of the urban cultures of the East. In her journal, she observed,
Despite the outward similarities the Acropolis shares with the city Naxos, I cannot help but feel the underlying disorientation of life on the borders of the Lyman.
The entry hinted at her realization that life in the Acropolis possessed fundamental differences, often unmistakable differences, with the eastern cities of the Provenance. Roughly 20,000 persons. Footnote 3. Oron recorded the ideogram for the prime number 20,117, to be exact, after he admitted the hex and the wayfarers accompanying Sidra. End footnote. Roughly 20,000 persons resided within the walls of the Acropolis. Denizens of the fortress outposts who arrived from every city attempted to recreate the comforts and familiarities of the life of their eastern homes. Situated as it was on the boundaries of the West Lyman, outcasts from the cultures of the Lyman routinely found respite within the walls of the Acropolis. It was by no means as uncommon as Sidra suggested when she noted in her journal,
I was admittedly bewildered by the scene of an orc and a goblin in the merchant district arguing over the price of thistles as we passed by.
Footnote 4. Acantha was a variety of milk thistle that half-orcs and other barbarians of the Provenance chewed as a sedative to curtail their passions. In his translation of Hanifa's Tome of Plants, El Dinawari noted the lore indicating that barbarians masticated the leaves of the thistle, causing the thorns to puncture many tiny holes in the cheeks, gums, and tongue to permit the milky sap to directly enter the bloodstream. See Note 131 in El Dinawari, translation of Tome of Plants by Hanifa. Baghdad, 3853 of the Metal Age. End footnote. The overt cultural diversity pointed to one obvious distinction in life at the Acropolis, while deflecting attention from the many surreptitious and moral indiscretions that the politics of the city at the extremity harbored. Like the East, on the other hand, adventurous philosophers established guilds for each of the classical powers, transforming the Acropolis into a remote but vital lyceum for young novices in the arcane wisdoms. The local association for the mechanic arts guardedly managed its membership to promote mutual good offices and fellowship, to encourage genius and reward the trustworthy. Footnote 5. From Associated Mechanics and Metalsmiths of the Acropolis, Constitution. In the Acropolis, around the 10th epoch, second period of the Arcane Age. End footnote. The mercantile cartels colluded to control the commercial trade among the other interests of the Acropolis, as well as the transport of staple goods from the eastern cities of the Provenance. And of course, the voices of common farmers and mercenaries resounded off the bulwarks when heated discussions about the most important political news of the day interrupted their labors. Among other familiar aspects of life at the Acropolis, Sidra observed the typical spatial divisions of the city and outposts that reinforced a shared sense of equality and well-being in the Provenance. In each of the 5 corners formed by the city walls, the citizens of the Provenance identified one of the significant social and economic interests of the Provenance: the classical powers, the mechanic arts, the mercantile cartels, the militia, including Hex, and the commoners. See Illustration 6. Illustration 6. Coins and logos of the Acropolis. A diagram of the Acropolis. Each of the 5 sides of the pentagonal structure stretched for 1/3 of a league, or 1 mile. In the 5 coin or corners of the Acropolis, one of the 5 primary interests of the Provenance resided. At the center, the logos, the central administration and meeting places of the people. To the bottom right is notation for 7 places in Sidra's narrative, and to the top right, several historical facts regarding the Acropolis. In each of the 5 corners formed by the city walls, the citizens of the Provenance identified one of the significant social and economic interests of the Provenance: the classical powers, the mechanic arts, the mercantile cartels, the militia, including Hex, and the commoners. The areas that extended for approximately half of the wall to each side of the corners typically encompassed the businesses and homes of the residents who made their livelihood from the designated interest of the district. Accompanied by Kivan, Sidra passed beneath the great towers guarding the inner gates of the Acropolis. To the south, her left, the mechanic artists built their smithies, tanneries, manufactories, ateliers, and other workshops for the production of artifacts. To the east, her right, the mercantile cartels founded their great trading houses and markets. In the corner to the west of the mercantile's quintile, or their fifth of the city, Sidra spotted the towers and manses of the guilds that advanced contemplative study of the classical powers. To the north of the merchant's quintile, the military quarters housed the Hex and other mercenaries under the command of the Dynasties, whose headquarters occupied the tower in the corner. In the corner furthest from the main entrance to the Acropolis, to the northwest beyond the city center, Sidra recognized the district reserved for commoners who worked in the traditional interests of the domain, farming and bureaucracy. Although certain inequalities existed, for instance, the commoners' quarters teemed with the largest populations, the neighborhoods welcomed all comers with suitable domiciles and guaranteed a workplace for those who settled to ply a trade governed by the district. In general, the spatial juxtapositions and residential division of the communities served as a constant reminder that the fruits of self-government and political equality arose from a harmony of interests between the five predominant classes of the province. The juxtaposition of the militia and the classical powers to the common quarters intimated the bond that these two powerful interests had with the interests of the people. The situation of the mechanic arts next to the classical powers also captured the historic ties between the two interests of the province, while the mercantile cartel's position next to the militia quarters served as an unsubtle reminder that the two interests were once one and the same under the Godhead's regimes in the preternatural age. Recalling her first glimpse at the fortress interior, Sidra noted with approval when she quoted a minor insight offered by Kivon. I have come to see how the Acropolis epitomizes the cosmic order of the Republic, Politeia in the Elvish. The divisions of the Acropolis indeed held little significance without the people that turned those spaces into places. For the three interests and the militia, the area radiating around their cornerstones in the Acropolis walls, or their coins, served as both homes and workplaces. Solitary homesteaders found the domain too treacherous to build cottages near their fields, and the great mass of horticulturalists and earthworkers made their homes within the city walls. For instance, in Libua, each morning the field hands trekked to the arable tracts allotted to them, lugging their tools through the city center, where the arcanists and local militia emerged to offer protection. The assembled contingent then moved through the marketplaces of the mechanics and merchants, giving ample time to those who needed to purchase a few goods before the long day of field labor. At the Acropolis, where fresh produce had to be shipped from Libua, or cultivated in the large public gardens along the exterior walls, most commoners specialized in mining and quarry excavation for the valuable ores, minerals, and gems hidden inside Eurynomy's bedecked crown. Each morning, the march of the day laborers through the spatial order of the Acropolis, as in the other cities of the province, forced the residents to engage in social and commercial intercourse. Moreover, whether from the flow of bodies, goods, services, or monies, the architecture of this Arcane Age outpost channeled residents through the city center, where involuntary congregations drew together individuals from all five interests of the province. The incessant hustle and bustle, from periphery to hub and back again, fashioned the whole life of provincial culture, outwardly materializing the mutual dependency of the social groups as if the five interests radiated from out of the center of the city. In both spirit and form, the city center furnished a neutral ground, equidistant from the district quintiles, where citizens met on equal terms to negotiate contracts or to litigate grievances. In a certain respect, however, the commercial ethos of the age may have originated in mysticism for the Pentagon, as Ptolemy of Nunst argued. The spatial order of the Arcane Age cities centered on an inner pentagon that demarcated the public space of the community and embodied the zeal for self-governance among the arcane peoples. As amateur geometricians and occultists commonly know, a pentagram inscribed within a pentagon by drawing diagonals from each corner to the two furthest corners produces a second pentagon inverted with a fixed ratio in size to the original pentagon. See illustration 6 above. Unsurprisingly, the arcane peoples regarded the innermost pentagon of their communities as a sacred space to assemble for debates on the political direction of the province and to legislate laws. In some sense, the city center, the logos. Footnote 6. The Elven word logos was always capitalized when in reference to the city center or prime numerology. It translates into the Western language tradition with the same spelling, but possesses many meanings, including words, discourse, account, speech, and in mathematics, ratio. See the long entry in Colgin's vocabulary. End footnote. In some sense, the city center, the Logos, is where the people of the young republic originally took shape, as an old adage suggests. A verse. In the Logos we meet to mix together, to erect the republic of the five coin, and conjure the people of the Provenance. Footnote 7. A certain nuance is lost in the translation. In the original Arcane language, two different forms of the pronoun we were used. Much like the way the pronoun you has both singular and plural references to the second person, the Arcane peoples use two different forms of the pronoun we to designate singular and plural combinations of people. In the plural form, we signifies the inescapable divisions and factions that accompany nearly all assemblages of persons. In the singular form, the we suggests such perfect combination that individuality of the persons combined into the first person plural no longer exists. In the original, the Arcane fragment deliberately deploys the plural form of the term we in order to convey the sense of the peoples mixing together. The adage is not attributed to an original author, but first appears in Nolos, the First Laws of the Provenance, stanza 127. End footnote. A verse. In the Logos we meet to mix together, to erect the republic of the five coin, and conjure the people of the Provenance. End verse. Thus, in the Logos of the communities, the city builders of the Provenance constructed great meeting halls and administration buildings for the people's public business. Figuratively speaking, it was the Logos that beat with the democratic elan at the heart of the republic and circulated the people's business from the Logos to each of the five districts, the civil society, as if to harmonize the commercial interests of the Provenance. Undoubtedly, Kivon had in mind the workmanlike central administration buildings of the Logos surrounded by the more ornate structures of the districts when he explained what he meant by the cosmic order of the Republic. In a way, the dwarven architecture at the Acropolis shows clearly the defining characteristics of the peoples of the Provenance, our visceral democracy encased within the florid patina of mercantile affectations and noble tastes. It's unlikely that Kivon intended to disparage the people of his time when he described the democracy as visceral. The commoner's commitment to the institutions of the Provenance may have seemed instinctual or earthy to a ranger, no less so than to our modern cynics. But the common-sense notions of equality that girded the democratic practices of the Provenance encompassed the basic intelligence of the peoples of the domain. As one popular aphorism which intended no hyperbole claimed, a verse. All citizens of the Provenance possess liberty, equality, fraternity, and the shared wisdom of Agrigentum's tome. End verse. While the fourth possession may seem out of place with the abstract concepts that precede it, the motto makes an allusion to the mass of citizens who assembled near the central administration building each day. Footnote 8. Like most scholarship on the Arcane Age, the following sketch of democracy and the social conditions of the Provenance is indebted to the magisterial insights of Hervé von Villecoquet in De Démocratie en Provence, Democracy in the Provenance, Paris, 587 of the Golden Age. End footnote. While the fourth possession may seem out of place with the abstract concepts that precede it, the motto makes an allusion to the mass of citizens who assembled near the central administration building each day. As remarkable as it may seem, Agrigentum revolutionized the intellectual life of the Provenance even more than she advanced the classical powers. In the Arcane Age, unlike the modern era, reading was not a private affair pursued in the comfort of one's homes by firelight or lamp with an erudite book or subversive pamphlet. Although scrolls, crude leaves of parchment made from hides, and certainly the writing tablets of the wizards existed, the age long preceded the invention of papyrus scrolls and codices, not to mention mechanical mass-production bookbinding. Few families afforded or invested in the clumsy and bulky tomes of the age. Consequently, when families spent their idle days and evenings educating children about Agrigentum's work, most headed to the city center to read the texts chiseled into the outer face of the walls forming the great meeting halls of the city. The community thus joined in caucuses at the city center to study Agrigentum's musings on the nature of being, the classical powers, and social justice. Young and old milled about and engaged in thoughtful debate on the strengths and shortcomings of her opus. In turn, these practices produced a kind of functional literacy among the entire population of the province, regardless of citizens' participation in the government, success in the mastery of a classical power, or the accumulation of wealth. The popular culture surrounding Agrigentum's verses fostered self-assuredness among the most impoverished members of the society, as strongly felt as the instinct to live freely. It also created a sense of fraternity throughout the population that curbed even the most pretentious state functionaries and merchants. In this respect, the visceral democracy of the province prefigured a middle ground between a deficiency of equality and an excess of liberty. As much as in political life, Agrigentum's tome played a powerful role in the economic culture of the province. The florid patina of mercantile affectations and noble tastes also originated in the verses of Agrigentum's work. The stonemasons enumerated each line of the verse carved into the stone walls of the public treasure, educating the populace with the basic symbols and arithmetic of the Arcane Age numerological system. In the arcane system of mathematics, every prime number was represented by a unique ideogram. As young people of the province read through 4,999 lines of Agrigentum's verse and the brief dedication to her mother, students of her work became knowledgeable of the first 669 primes and their ideograms. Footnote 9. In arcane numerology, the number 1 was considered the number of being. Being and the number 1 were present to all prime numbers, as in the representation through multiplication: 2 times 1, 3 times 1, 5 times 1, 7 times 1, etc., etc. But 1 was not regarded as a prime number in itself. The representation of 1 as a prime number, in other words, 1 times 1, would not have occurred to arcane numerologists, because it made no sense to suggest that being was present or multiplied to itself. End footnote. As young people of the province read through 4,999 lines of Agrigentum's verse and the brief dedication to her mother, students of her work became knowledgeable of the first 669 prime numbers and their ideograms. All prime number values were subsequently represented by a combination of those ideograms. Composite numbers were often represented by the largest prime number that did not exceed the total value, plus the ideogram for the primal substances, 2, 3, 5, or 7, and or of the logos of time, 11, 13, 17. For example, the number 100 was represented by the ideogram for 97 plus the ideogram for 3, like 97 plus 3. Though the arcane numeral system used a different glyph to signify the addition of two numbers. The number 1000 was represented by the ideograms 997 plus 3. Footnote 10. In this manner, the arcanes represented all even numbers in the combination of 2 ideograms, and all odd numbers in the combination of no more than 3 ideograms. Note, too, that the only exception to the ideographic system was the number 4, which had its own unique ideogram that also represented the 4 primal substances in general. End footnote. The number 1000 was represented by the ideograms 997 plus 3. Though this numeral system became more and more complex as arcane mathematicians discovered larger and larger prime numbers and the minutiae and magnitude of the universe, better known to the arcane philosophers, most commoners engaged in rudimentary mercantile calculations that rarely required knowledge of prime numbers larger than 4,999. Thus, from the reading and rereading of the great stone work, all citizens eventually acquired an intimate knowledge of the complex symbols of the numeric system of primes that the arcane peoples used to measure quantities. In part, then, Kievan's barb at the commercial bent of the peoples of the province, their mercantile affectations, stemmed from the tertiary skills in counting and basic arithmetic that popular knowledge of Agrigentum's work engendered. Footnote 11. Thus introduced to the work of Agrigentum at a youthful age, nearly all children in the province completed a primary education in reading and arithmetic before the end of their 13th year of life. At the beginning of the second triskaidecade of their lives, the High Council of the Provenance arranged for all children to begin an apprenticeship in one of the classical powers. While most youth failed to discover an innate ability in the classical powers, the intellectual specialization and social bonds formed at this time often influenced their future choice of profession as a mechanic artist or merchant. Even those that went on to become farmers, militiamen, or council bureaucrats, the commoners' trades, preserved their ties to the three great interests and sometimes contributed to the advancement of the arcane philosophies as Agrigentum once had. See Brew, Naxian Ethic, page 83. End footnote. In part, then, Kivon's barb at the commercial bent of the peoples of the Provenance, their mercantile affectations, stem from the tertiary skills in counting and basic arithmetic that popular knowledge of Agrigentum's work engendered. The logos took shape out of necessity for the urban spaces to conform to the commercial will of its citizens. In this respect, coin, as much as the coin, defined provenantial politics. As the sun set further behind the spires of the Urinwe, looming far above the ramparts, the two companions, Sidra and Kivon, left the promenade between the merchants and mechanics' quintiles. The view to the northwest revealed the massive administrative structure at the heart of the fortress. When she entered the Logos, however, Sidra caught sight of an embankment unique to the Acropolis, walls surrounding the central administration building. A small queue stood behind a gate, waiting to be hurriedly led around the building in a single file. Large, well-armed mercenaries collected tolls from the individuals or groups who stepped forward to enter the walls. When asked about the scene, Kivon relayed disturbing events at the Acropolis that violated the most fundamental notions of social justice in the Provenance. Recent events that had not been reported to the High Council at the time Sidra left Naxos. A merchant, the very same merchant, who recently disappeared into the Lyman and nearly cost Sidra her life, somehow won approval to purchase and occupy the great hall of the Logos, traditionally reserved for local administration and public meetings. As Kivon described the circumstances to her, a majority of the citizens voted to accept the merchant's offer to purchase the building in return for a large sum of coins. After receiving assurances that access to the administration building's exterior walls would remain open to the public for a nominal fee. After taking ownership of the building, to the contrary, the merchant contracted with local masons to raise a 5-cubit-high wall around the entire edifice and to install a gate to restrict freedom of movement through the Logos, ostensibly to protect the people's richest treasures from an attack by plotters or madmen, Kivon explained. Then, claiming that the cost of the people's business exceeded expectations, the merchant set fees at a level that made it impossible for the poorest residents of the Acropolis to visit and explore the work of Agrigentum more than once or twice per month. When well-meaning denizens of the Acropolis raised their objections to the course of events, the merchant and his allies suggested, "The poor are in such a state because they lack frugality and industry. When the indigent among us work harder and save more, contribute their fair share to our precarious society on the borders of the Lyman, only then will they have earned the right to the magisterial words of Agrigentum." That argument, Kivon grimly noted, carried the day. The dispossession of the people's commons, the Logos, at the Acropolis seemed to be a symptom in the cleric's manner of thinking, which exposed the underlying corruption of an undemocratic fervor among the inhabitants at the remote outpost. Little wonder, then, that Sidra recorded in her journal,
I am discomfited by this duty, to rescue a merchant who seemed more foreign to the Provenance than a 3-headed hydra.
Detoured by the walls surrounding and blocking access to Agrigentum's text, Sidra and Kivon toured the Acropolitan section for the classical powers on their way to the tap rooms and boarding houses managed by the common stock in the quintile furthermost from the gates. The conversation between the two arcanists dwelt on the origins of liberty and equality in the Provenance, as well as the relationship of law and social well-being to the longevity of its power in the domain. The dialogue reveals the nuances in perspective between a cleric of Naxos and a ranger of Vigrinio. Sidra, recalling her recent journey from the eastern cities, suggested that the geographic mobility of the peoples of the Provenance guaranteed that no person or family, no person or family, secured pernicious influences over the political or economic life of the western cities. In her words,
Few of the wealthiest city dwellers in the east attempted to resettle in the dangerous and poorly provisioned outposts along the Lyman. Those who gained great wealth during their time in the west tended to return to their original cities after several years.
in her estimation, both tendencies dissuaded families or philosophers who might gain an inordinate hold over the politics of civic administration. Footnote 12. One of the few points of consensus among modern scholars of the Arcane Age, following the general argument of Villers-Cocquet's democracy in the Provenance. End footnote. In her estimation, both tendencies dissuaded families or philosophers who might gain an inordinate hold over the politics of civic administration. All the more reason, she judged, to question the causes that led to the construction of a wall around the public house of the Acropolis.
The isolation and distance of the Acropolis from the councils should have strengthened the city's commitment to law and social well-being.
Sidra summarized. Kievan agreed to a point, but the wanderlust of the Rangers and the political bent of the Agrinians surfaced in his rebuttal. To his mind, the peoples of the Domain first discovered our equality under the despotisms of the Godheads. The economic division between the peons, those who worked the land, and the nobles, those who managed the bureaucracy. Footnote 13. The brutal Hecatomanicaire and the one-armed purse-bearers. End footnote. The economic division between the peons, those who worked the land, and the nobles, those who managed the bureaucracy, invented inauthentic inequalities that masked the underlying equality of our ancestors in abject servitude to fear and the commandments of the Godheads. True to his arcane philosophy, Kievan rejected the assertion that remoteness proved to be a sufficient catalyst for law and social well-being. The knowledge of Agrigentum's tome without the agency to deploy that knowledge in their own interests, or against the Godheads, would have added little to the quality of life in the Domain. He asserted, the Arcane Age's dual commitments to liberty and equality, personal autonomy and social well-being, perhaps has become unfathomable in our times. The dispute between this cleric and ranger certainly presents great difficulties for the modern mind. Nonetheless, if the reader takes care to distinguish the distinctions between the arcane term liberty and the modern term freedom, an age that seems fantastical will be recognized as a fertile commune buried beneath the barren self-regard for our times. In one of our modern peculiarities, freedom has come to mean freedom from government, freedom from taxes, freedom from the responsibilities for liberty. In the Arcane Age, the people spoke of liberty, as in the liberty to self-govern, liberty to associate in their guilds and their alehouses, the liberty to share responsibility for political equality. In the arcane world, the peoples affirmed the necessity of their social contract in order to live with personal character and cultural dignity. Or, to quote the wisdom of Agrigentum, liberty prevails in just equality. Footnote 14. From Agrigentum on Nature, line 67. End footnote. In the arcane world, the peoples affirm the necessity of their social contract in order to live with personal character and cultural dignity. Or, to quote the wisdom of Agrigentum, liberty prevails in just equality. As an agent of the councils, Sidra reminded Kievan she ascribed to the belief that the rule of law in the Provenance played a vital role in the liberty of the age. To make her point, she recalled the slow recovery of the preternatural cities of the Domain during the Arcane Age.
The long, drawn-out process of reclamation firmly granted the council's authority over much of the propertied wealth in the Provenance, as well as the power to allot the most fertile or resourceful lands to the volunteers of the Hex.
Moreover, the Hex earned the privileges to work moray of land, but none secured outright ownership of the plots to transfer to others through sale or inheritance. As Sidra noted to herself in her journal after her stay in Libua,
The Libuans affirmed for me my mentor's favorite axiom: no farmer tilled land, no mechanic crafted goods, and no merchant traded wares without the fostering hand of the councils.
As the two arcane philosophers passed from the classical powers quintile into the commoners sector, Kivon rejoined the debate on the side of liberty over equality. He gently reminded Sidra that the Western citizens of the Provenance celebrated liberty as the first and most prized possession of the Republic. A fervor for personal autonomy recorded in the arcane proverb that he recited. A verse. Beyond chance and the wisdom of the councils, liberty reigns in the eminent domain. End verse. Kivon suggested that the sovereignty of the people, the dignified phrase for liberty in the arcane world, seemingly rendered every citizen of the Provenance enlightened, virtuous, and competent for self-governance, irrespective of the accumulated personal wealth or stature in the three great interests. In the Provenance, he countered, the freedom of individuals joined with the conditions of the society to achieve more than the wickedest and most despotic godhead ever dreamed to achieve. According to his understanding of personal liberty and accomplishment, the legislation of the councils guided matters of property, wealth, and inheritance. Ultimately, however, the sovereignty of the people pervaded the most minute considerations of the citizens of the Provenance to such an extent that no motion or practice adopted by the various classical guilds, mechanic associations, and mercantile cartels intentionally violated the most basic tenets of individual liberty, and thus did not require the oversight of the councils. Footnote 15. Undoubtedly, the enthusiasm for individual distinction and accomplishment gives the Arcane Age that tinge of an early and petty form of materialism. An extravagant taste for personal talismans, accumulated plunder, or magical artifacts, often described in modern pulp novels. Yet, whilst this is not a wholly inaccurate picture of the period, it neglects to take into account how equality in the Provenance extended to the intelligence, economic opportunities, and liberty of the entire populace. End footnote. To be sure, Sidra conceded to Kivon, a few citizens attained great wealth with no discernible connection to the councils. Notwithstanding, the councils faithfully crafted legislation guided by the overriding principle that the laws of the Provenance must appeal to the interests of the Commonwealth. As case in point, Sidra recalled the godheads who favored the right of the firstborn to inherit the entirety of parents' wealth, or primogeniture. The law established generational allegiance of noble families to the titular head of state and ensured the reproduction of bureaucratic labor for the godheads. Footnote 16. In the preternatural age, the sons and daughters who inherited little from their noble parents often chose to become members of the mercenary Hecatomononker, to avoid becoming members of the despised commoners who worked the land. Lame or cowardly children of the nobles volunteered as the merchant tax collectors of the godheads. In substance, the Hex had much in common with the folk that they routinely terrorized. Both held no essential legal favor under the theocracy of the godheads, and fundamentally, the mercenaries and peons were subject to the caprices of the godheads. In a recent article, one scholar argues that the frequent atrocities of the Hecatomononker served as ritualistic acts that affected a sense of social distance between the mercenaries and the peasants of the godheads. In this respect, notably, brutality structured the social world and identities of the preternatural age more so than the statements of principles. See Laura Schaap, Inventing the Hecatomononker, Stoolies, Soldiers, Mercenaries, and Thugs, from the Journal of the Early Provenance, Volume 29, Number 2, published in 929 of the Golden Age, pages 199 to 211. End footnote.
Before the recovery of Pauline, the Provenance effectively barred the accumulation of great wealth that noble families claimed under the Godhead's regimes. The first laws of our councils required children share equally in the estates of parents, guaranteeing a more equitable transfer of generational wealth.
Near the end of the Arcane Age, the last vestiges of hereditary rank and riches diminished to the point that all persons seemed to possess the same stature. Footnote 17. Here again, as in other matters of state, the peoples of the Provenance seem to model their world around the perceived nature of the classical powers. The reader will recall that the classical powers were not hereditary, and that the calling of arcane abilities was not passed from parents to children like genetic code. The classical powers seemed to favor individuals, not families, and, as Sidra argued, the councils of the Provenance passed legislation that amplified the cultivation of personal distinction over familial heritage. End footnote. In Sidra's perspective, equality, law, and the well-being of all citizens guaranteed the liberties that the peoples of the Provenance enjoyed.
In most questions of land and inheritance, the laws of the Provenance decisively permeated the consciousness and accomplishments of the people.
Sidra reflected, referencing the two most fundamental considerations in the penurious and perilous life of the Arcane Age. Sidra's record of her exchange with Kivon perhaps exemplifies best that no culture in all of world history dedicated itself more thoroughly to the cultivation of individual aspirations and accomplishments without, at the same time, jeopardizing the reproduction of widespread social well-being. While the two arcane philosophers' discourse focused on which concept proved more important to the longevity of the Provenance, the widespread favor for both the sovereignty of the people and the rule of law captured the commitment to liberty and equality in the Provenance. The peoples of the Provenance, in fact, had a term to describe the crucible of mutual interests, koinopolitia, roughly translating as the Commonwealth or public good. In this single word, the arcane peoples expressed their endearment for liberty and equality, intelligence and commercialism, innovation and tradition, distinction and mutuality. For a millennium, the public good made possible a stereoscopic vision of a future that endeavored to perfect the law as literal manifestations of the sovereignty of the individual and to extend social well-being as a universal calling to equality in the Provenance. Sidra cited a 5-line arcane adage, later recorded in the papers of the Interpolis Commoners Association, that lends further insight.
Is it not impossible to imagine our citizens unequal in well-being, yet forever equal in liberty? They must become unequal in liberty in the end, or equal to in well-being.
Footnote 18, from the dedication to the arcane peoples in the ICA's Commoners Manifesto. End footnote. The adage indelibly recalls how the peoples of the Provenance regarded liberty and equality as complementary forces in an age in which common weal determined success in private matters. Neither Sidra nor Kivon wholly grasped the manner in which the two ethics created the fraternity that many provenantial citizens took for granted. For our purposes, it is enough to know that the Provenance, characterized by its educated and mobile populace, indisputably stimulated an unprecedented age of innovation and invention in world history. Footnote 19. To some, this assertion may sound like nothing more than the hyperbole of a scholar who has become too enthralled with his or her subject matter. The industrialization of the Middle Golden Age or the digitization of the Late Golden Age surely outstripped the inventiveness of a backward arcane world, they will object. Such skeptics, however, fail to consider that we moderns have largely lost both our ability and memory for the classical powers. Perhaps if the victors of the First Great War had not so thoroughly extinguished the philosophers and philosophies of the Arcane Age, we would live in a much different world in which our ancestors bequeathed the knowledge and the artifacts of the classical powers to the present day. In truth, we moderns are woefully at a loss to grasp the variety, quality, and volume of inventiveness during this period. End footnote. For our purposes, it is enough to know that the Provenance, characterized by its educated, mobile populace, indisputably stimulated an unprecedented age of innovation and invention in world history. The mercantile cartels fostered wide networks of exchange in which both objects and know-how spread quickly from east to west linemen, and vice versa. Merchants' private efforts to trade with the cultures of the linemen frequently introduced new reagents to the mechanic artists of the cities and carried word of strange new discoveries for the classical powers. Mechanic artists, dedicated equally to artistry and functionality, secured personal distinction and renown for their craftsmanship and innovation. Annual mechanic fairs, organized for the improvement and advancement of the mechanic arts, encouraged spirited competitions that frequently resulted in new methods of production or reagents that tuned to the classical powers more effectively. Lastly, though most importantly, the philosophers of the classical powers never relented in their endeavors to discover and harness new abilities in their callings, and the guilds accumulated that arcane knowledge for over a millennium. The three separate yet singularly focused efforts for the deployment of the classical powers created a world grotesquely rich in coin, knowledge, and artifacts, as Sidra soon learned. Our disputants' conversation ended as they arrived at the inn that Kivon had recommended to Sidra. The cleric bid her newfound friend good night and turned to enter the inn.
Before closing the door behind me, I glanced over my shoulder to catch a glimpse of the wise, if misguided, ranger. I blushed when I saw that he too turned to look back at me. I dodged quickly into the inn in hopes he did not recognize my heartfelt interest in him. I checked into the hostel for the evening, exhausted, embarrassed, and excited by events of my first adventure into the Lyman.
She recorded in her personal journal that evening. And this concludes Chapter 7 of Arcane Cage.